Hey Heather, how are you doing today?
Hi, good. How are you?
Good. So I thought just to kind of kick us off a little bit, it would be helpful to understand a bit more about your roles within Mars and kind of how Ignition Labs fits within there, if you don't mind giving us a little bit of background to kick things off.
Absolutely. So it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to our discussion. I lead our Mars Inc.'s global strategic partnerships with Google, Facebook, and Amazon, as well as other digital platforms, including Snap, Twitter, and TikTok. What this basically means is that I work with each of the platforms to develop the strategic roadmap and KPIs in collaboration with the segments, which includes pet care, confectionery, and food, to drive value and accelerate business growth. I'm also the creator of Ignition Labs, as you mentioned, and Ignition Labs is really created out of the realization that we weren't moving fast enough to keep up with the pace of the ever-changing, evolving media landscape. So whether it be a new format on an existing platform or a completely new platform altogether, we needed to create a system that would enable us to keep at the leading edge of innovation with regard to content, media, and commerce. So really the purpose of Ignition Labs is to accelerate our rollout onto these new platforms or to get deeper into existing ones and looking at what consumer behaviors we need to pay attention to unlock that full value.
Sounds exciting. Definitely a lot of different moving factors within the role and kind of overseeing two divisions that work seamlessly together, I would imagine.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Obviously, there's a lot over the past year. There's been a lot of new changes, even just within social channels and different products that exist to be able to communicate with consumers. How, when you guys are looking at embracing a new platform or a new channel, what are some of the criteria that you and your team look at to evaluate what brand makes sense from within the Mars portfolio? How do you want to interact with that channel? How are you going to find consumers on that channel?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we look at it we take a very much an outside in approach to it. So first we look at it from two different angles. So one is looking at it from a consumer behavior point of view. So understanding what types of actions they're taking online and where does our brand have the right to play in that space. So what's picking up traction, particularly among younger audiences, which are always a little bit harder to reach. And then the second is from a platform perspective, what is that new buzzy platform that we need to pay attention to? And is it encouraging different types of behaviors of what we're currently seeing? So TikTok is a great example that, I think we've talked a lot about over the past couple of years. And then Clubhouse is probably the kind of the new one that we're starting to look at. And so from there, then we say, after we've determined the platform and the consumer behavior we want to go after, then we determine, okay, what market is that platform really picking up a lot of traction in? So once we've chosen the market, then we go into what segment and brand is the best fit for that. So it's very much a kind of a different way of looking. It's not looking at a brand first and then the platform. It's actually completely opposite, but it because we look at it from a different way, it just enables us to develop different types of tests, because what we don't want to do is keep chasing the shiny object, because that kind of becomes an endless cycle. What we want to be able to do is take notice of what's happening and then figure out, how does this apply to our brands, and what do we aim to learn on that? I think the key also is that we want to go beyond just traditional off-the-shelf media formats and activations and sponsorships, and we really want to understand how can we authentically connect with consumers in new and different ways. So I'd say just a quick example of that is we've been in the gaming space for a couple of years with Twitch, but what we wanted to understand is how do we integrate our Twix brand? That's always a tongue twister, to find the right balance of brand and product integration into gaming content. So what we had done in the past is leverage the media formats that Twitch just offers as a general package, but what we wanted to do was understand how do we integrate Mars into that gaming environment in a way that that consumers or users acknowledge or accept, right? Because we also don't want to interrupt that experience. And so what I find exciting about that is that not only were we the most branded UK live stream over the past 12 months, but we also were able to scale that right back into the business immediately to optimize existing campaigns in other markets. And that's kind of the cycle that we're trying to achieve with these tests.
That makes sense. And because I would imagine that there's a need to have authenticity to appearing in new channels and finding the right brand within the portfolio, given you have 3 rather robust portfolios, lines of businesses across confections, pet care, and the foods. Are there specific channels, or are there, I guess, examples of when you feel like you've needed to take a step back before going to market because you realized through kind of testing that perhaps the right brand or the right creative wasn't being paired with the channel? And how do you pivot in those situations?
Yeah, I think TikTok is probably a good example in the sense that from a platform, we're still trying to figure out how to work with that platform, because obviously it's very UGC driven. Obviously hashtags challenges are hugely popular, and so we've done a few hashtag challenges, but what we had to do is take a step back from that and figure out how do we work with creators on that platform. We know we need to be there, and we know our brands are already there, whether we're leading that conversation or not. And so what we wanted to do is create an environment for our brands that we could test in a relatively safe way. So obviously brand safety is hugely important to us. And so what we did was work with creators on developing content that we then boosted with paid media. So that is an example of where we went out with hashtag challenges, and then we kind of had to pull it back a little bit to focus on elements within the platform that we had a little bit more control on, at least to run more tests on and figure out what our ways of working are and how we should approach it. But what we're very keen on doing is not necessarily to just walk away from a platform altogether, but it's more of just figuring out what the right balance is and how do we walk on that journey together versus start out with a sprint.
Yeah, that makes sense. It takes time to trial and error and see, I would imagine, even which brands are going to be well received within different environments, especially when you start to think about the audience differences that you find between those different platforms.
For sure. Yeah, and even what the audiences and also what they want to see on the platform. So obviously from a TikTok perspective, it's a lot more, it's the content's raw versus on an Instagram, it's more polished. So even figuring out how we approach that environment in a different way.
That makes sense. Yeah, the creative needs to feel organic within the environment that it's in. And I would imagine for brands with some of the heritage that the Mars brands have, there's been a trial and error period of getting comfortable with some of the rawness of the creative and the UGC environments.
Yes, for sure. And it has to align with our 5 principles as a company, as well as our overall marketing code. So there's a lot of elements that go into making sure that that platform and that environment is right for us.
And how do you what's the role of your team in kind of taking those learnings from different platforms or from some of these early pilot programs with a new platform like a TikTok or others, and disseminate those within the organization once you get some of the findings from your early pilot programs, and determine how or what other brands within the portfolios make sense to kind of explore a TikTok or another platform with next?
Yeah, so we work with once we've identified the brand and the market that we want to target and the platform that we want to go after, we bring the team, that local market team, along on the journey. So that's the first step. The second step is, it's usually not out of the blue of what we're looking like, the platforms that we look at and the consumer behavior that we're looking to test. So we wouldn't, so for gaming, for example, that was something that our confectionery teams had been doing a lot of work on, but they were approaching it more from that traditional media format perspective. And so in working with them, it was figuring out, how do we drive that deeper integration? Another example is a test that we did on Reddit, where we wanted to understand how we could integrate our Temptations cat treat brand into conversations that were already happening about cats in subreddit groups. Our goal was actually to drive cat adoption. So it wasn't about driving brand sales. And that was part of the strategy, because we know within Reddit groups, there's a high ad avoidance feeling. And, it's that you can't just come into a Reddit group and start advertising product straight up. So what we were able to do was garner valuable audience insights around driving this cat adoption, which ladders up to our overall purpose as our Mars Pet Care team, which is to eradicate pet homelessness. So it was very much aligned with our purpose and our vision as a segment. And we were able to get audience insights and upvotes on our content from users who claim that they would never upvote content from brands. And so from that test, the local market team was then able to take that learning and expand it to a bigger test within Reddit. So that's typically how, and that's actually like a huge focus of us, is it's great to run these tests, but if they're not relevant to the markets or the brands, then it's kind of a waste of time. So it's all about choosing tests that the teams can then get behind and expand once we've kind of figured out how to work and develop a playbook around that platform, and really make all the mistakes up front, so that we can then, so that it just creates a easier road ahead for the markets that are looking to learn a little bit more. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that idea of driving impact and having the relevance for the brand, and the Reddit example just sounds like, in that case, you guys were really hitting all the right notes, right? You were authentic to the space. It made sense for the audience that you were trying to reach in a way that didn't necessarily feel like branded advertising, which you knew through evaluation wasn't going to work in that environment. And it required a little bit of a different approach. And in that case, the focus on the personalization of the messaging, the driving impact, more sort of moment marketing that's a little bit more focused, less on product, more on experience, was something that was really going to resonate in that environment.
Yeah. And for that particular example, we didn't even put any like product shots on there. It was all about, we actually worked with a bunch of local shelters that had these actual cats up for adoption. So we featured pictures of cats that were available, waiting to get adopted. So it was a very, it definitely aligned with our purpose and our overall goals of eradicating pet homelessness in a way that was also true to that felt authentic for the brand.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that kind of lends itself to one of the other questions that I've been wondering about after initially connecting, which is, there's been a lot of change over the last 12 months for consumers. The way that each of the kind of 3 lines of business probably was positioned for that change was very different. There's obviously been tons and countless stories talking about shelters that were emptied out last spring as more people were realizing they were going to be home and they wanted company at home. How has the last 12 months influenced how you see your customers, I'm sure it's a little bit different whether you're looking at confections or pet care, as well as food prep. What have you kind of learned about your consumers over the last 12 months that might have been different, that have influenced how you kind of speak to them and what you're looking to engage with them around?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So when last spring, when lockdown came into full effect, we realized that there were tons of questions around, if I use pet care as an example, tons of questions around pets and COVID in general. And so what we did was through our Google partnership, we figured out kind of what the top search queries were around pets and COVID-19. And then 10 days later, we came out with a chatbot experience called the Pet Health Pal, that we launched on Facebook through Messenger and WhatsApp and which was powered by our Waltham Pet Care Science Institute. And we ran it in the US and in the UK. And it was really, the goal was to connect pet parents with relevant content from a trusted source and to dispel that misinformation around the virus and pets. And it was just a massive step change of how we approached content development in general. And it was a great example of how we were leveraging data and innovation to drive value quickly. We know that to your point, there were a lot of people that were adopting pets, not knowing where to start. And because we have that full ecosystem from the veterinary hospitals that we own all the way down to pet products that we sell, it felt like an easy place for us to drive that leadership and that overall conversation around how do we make sure that these pet parents are informed with the right information that would help them move forward with how they approached either raising a pet for the first time or figuring out what the virus and their pet, what it meant with the virus and their pet specifically. So that's just one example of ways that we've had to pivot. From a confectionery point of view, it was all about making sure that that our products were readily available to people. One of the things that we found is that during lockdown, people were craving, they wanted to be able to help and drive those, just be able to gift and give, especially for the frontline workers, is treating others, even though they couldn't do that in person. So we were able to launch what we called the Snickers System of Gratitude as one example. We also launched a similar campaign with M&Ms, but focusing on how do we enable people from their homes, from the safety of their own homes, to recognize and reward frontline workers as well as neighbors and friends, and drive that gifting experience in a safe way.
It's a great initiative, and one that I'm sure also they're all kind of great examples of the brand is kind of secondary almost to the messaging that you're doing, right? That a lot of it's more about connecting with the world around you and connecting with your consumers in a way that's really relevant and meaningful to them at that moment, not necessarily just pushing the product. As consumers and kind of like their journey from when they're first exposed to a brand online, whatever channel that might be, to when they are going to encounter it in a store has kind of evolved over the last 12 months. And that consumer journey has shortened in a way. How have you guys, what impact has that had on the actual messaging that you're doing for more branded campaigns?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we obviously approach it differently for our different brands, but our main goal is to make the consumer experience with our brands to be as frictionless as possible. So if we look at, a big source of inspiration is what's happening in China, to see where we will be in the next 3 to 4 years, where you can literally order a single Snickers bar off JD or Tmall and have it delivered to your home within 15 minutes. So when we think about that, how do we shorten that, understanding that we need to create that frictionless experience? How do we enable that within our brand? So an example that we have is Our M&M's brand has been in e-commerce for years, selling personalized M&Ms. Last week, Forrester announced that M&M's runs the best-in-class D2C website, which is super exciting. But figuring out how are we there in front of the consumer at moments where they're most they're most open to hearing from the brand and driving that purchase. So whether it be shopping for, being there with search results of when they're shopping for different types of party favors. Obviously that has kind of reduced over the past year, but what are some gifting opportunities that people can be giving virtually, and figuring out where are those moments for those natural purchases to be made, and having our products be available for that shoppable experience. So one of the things that we did early on too was ensure that all of our social creative was shoppable, and leveraging the power of Facebook to ensure that we could drive that frictionless conversion as much as possible.
That makes sense. Obviously, shoppable became key over the last 12 months.
Yeah.
Have you seen that influence kind of a change? Obviously, making sure that the creative itself is shoppable, but in the messaging, and has Mars considered kind of embracing the change in the actual creative itself and the scenes that you're depicting and kind of speaking to consumers? Or are you finding it more successful to kind of continue with like a status quo of how you're talking to consumers?
I think we're always looking at ways of how do we drive emotion out of consumers. So whether it's to make people laugh, cry, or drive some kind of just become some kind of service. So that's really like the core elements of what we are all about, that you'll see in all of our creative work. We did launch a pretty big new marketing mandate called Building Brands for Mutual Value, to ensure that we're harnessing the power of our brands to create shared value for the people, pets, and partners that we serve. So for example, one of the things that we did for Halloween this year was we launched this app called Treat Town. And it was in service of our Mars Wrigley purpose to make people smile. And knowing that Halloween looked a little bit different last year, Treat Town was launched in the US, and it was a digital experience for families to virtually trick or treat for real candy. And it was like this full-on virtual Halloween portal that really enabled, it was kind of a gamification of sorts, and it really just enabled people to still maintain that joy of Halloween, but to celebrate in a safe and COVID-friendly way. So again, it's just one example of how we've been able to pivot. I think another good example is the pedigree work that we launched initially on Zoom, where it's literally called Dogs on Zoom. And it was kind of similar to what I was talking about with Reddit, but it was connecting potential adopters with shelter dogs virtually. And so it was, the shelters would be on Zoom, and the potential adopters would be looking at those dogs that were available. We have since then also extended that to Clubhouse, and to allow people, and running sessions to allow people to pick potential dogs to hopefully drive adoption within that. So those are just some examples of how we've pivoted our messaging to be more relevant. I would say the other thing that we're doing too is we're really starting to experiment on how to become more relevant with even some of the products that we're developing. So through our global partnership with Google, we worked with Google Cloud to develop our first ever Maltesers AI cake. And this was in the UK. So what we were doing is really leveraging AI to push into a more creative space by listening to consumer intent and purchase and preference, to ensure that our brands could connect in contextually relevant ways. So we had a Google Cloud engineer literally create this whole machine learning model using hundreds of existing recipes from everything from tray bakes to scones to develop this new cake creation. And this AI cake, which is technically a cakey, which is it's a hybrid between a cookie and a cake, was created based on Google search trends of what people were looking for. And then we actually created this Marmite infused buttercream frosting, based again on Google search trends and trying to figure out what would resonate the most with consumers. So something that we just launched this past week for Easter in the UK, and it was just a really interesting, different way of thinking about recipe development and giving consumers a new way of looking at a recipe, or a combination of ingredients. I mean, I would never have put Maltesers and Marmite together, but just thinking about how we can use science and the great resources we have with Google into and develop more creative driven ideas based on that. So it was super, it was just a completely different way of looking at recipe development as another example.
Definitely seems like a local delicacy to
Yeah.
the UK market,
Yeah.
but a very different way. And I'm sure for the brand, it's also just different, right? You don't typically think of some of the confectionery brands as being within the recipe game, but it was an opportunity for you guys to be in a different space and speak to consumers through kind of a different lens. How, as different countries, of course, are coming out of lockdowns at different speeds and kind of embracing the next chapter a little bit differently. How do you see the creativity and the way you're engaging with consumers continue to evolve? The more personalization, is this something that you see continuing to be a trend, the shortened consumer journey that you need to lean into?
Yeah, I mean, everything that we are doing, it needs to be meaningfully personal to the consumers that we serve. So we're very much looking at how and through our marketing mandate of building brands for mutual value, how do we it's a constant question that we have in terms of how do we engage with consumers in different ways. And so as people come out of lockdown, obviously there's going to be a lot more people are going to be wanting to be out and social and about. And so, one of the areas is gum. So it's something that probably a lot of people didn't really think about during lockdown because of the reduction of social interactions and social visits. But coming out of lockdown, how do we make sure that our gum messaging makes sense and is relevant? And that's something that we're actively working on, and more to come on that soon. But making sure that the product is available not only through the work that we're doing with Facebook and other social channels, but also being available physically where people are interacting and trying to catch up for lost time with their friends.
Yeah, and I would imagine that in the past where you might have had a broader target, right? Kind of for gum, it was anyone with a mouth essentially needed gum. There might be a shift in how you're looking to segment down those audiences with different, just with different stages of comfort that people will even have, and how you're going to be talking to them creatively.
Yeah. Like one example is dating. So how do we, based on behavior online, knowing that if people are single and wanting to get out and date again, that messaging would obviously be a lot different than a family getting together for the first time in months. So we're very much looking at how do we develop creative that is relevant to the audiences that we want to target and serve.
Makes sense. And when you're kind of creating these different, whether it's different channels, different creative messaging, looking beyond, obviously for some of the examples you've given, some great examples around the personalization, whether it's Zoom and dogs or Reddit and cats, when you are looking beyond simply driving purchase intent, how are you guys looking to evaluate the success there? Are there metrics that you are looking for kind of to see a new channel proving out its success or a new creative strategy proving out success that you'll continue to look at over the next year?
Yeah, and I think it depends on the platform, right? Because we're very evidence-based marketers, so our ultimate measure of success is if it's a regular campaign, it's did this drive sales lift, right? But then obviously, TikTok, for example, is just rolling out its sales lift capabilities in the US. So when we're looking at some platforms that don't have that, Clubhouse definitely doesn't have sales lift capabilities yet. So it's really about driving that connection and figuring out how, from the adoption perspective, that would be the KPI. There would be what number of how many dogs did we get adopted through that campaign. And so it really depends on the creative and what that overall objective is. But I would say that for us, it's all about, we actually don't really look as much at like purchase intent or brand lift, because it's more of what consumers say they're going to do versus what they actually do. And we found that sometimes that can be different. So it's really more, what is the evidence that an action was taken, whether that be through a sales lift or through, from a purpose-driven focus, the number of dogs or cats adopted off of Reddit, Clubhouse, Zoom,
Yeah,
et cetera.
the different platforms.
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes sense. And I would imagine, just you were mentioning earlier, kind of the role of emotion from ours, right? That a lot of the creative you're doing is designed to evoke some sort of emotion, knowing that emotion is really one of the strongest kind of drivers of human behavior. And that I would imagine that depending on the emotion that you're looking to evoke with the particular piece of creative, that would influence what you're actually looking at as to see a success. That success does not necessarily, as you just said, correspond to sales alone, that there are other metrics that can lend itself to your campaign feeling successful.
Exactly. Makes
sense. Are there any, I guess, just kind of as we start to wrap up and get closer to 2 o'clock, are there any channels that you, or I guess any brands that you think have exciting kind of upcoming launches within channels that you are eager to see how they play out in the next few months?
Yeah, so I think, we are, as I mentioned, we have done an initial test on Clubhouse, still really keen to understand a little bit more about that space and also how it can scale to other brands. So we did it with Pedigree, but now trying to figure out what does that look like for confectionery as an example. And then we're also looking at, knowing that the social commerce space is huge. So figuring out how do we connect with consumers in that environment. And so if you look at like TikTok, for example, where they did their first live stream with Walmart at the end of last year, what could that possibly look like for our brands? We did the chatbot work. We're looking to also get a little bit more understanding of where messaging can play a bigger role in our overall brand conversation. And so that's another area of exploration, but more to come in this space for sure. And we're still very much looking. So if anybody has any other ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Great. And I'm not sure if we have time. We do have one question that came through, where if Marty, we're out of time.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Well, thanks so much, Heather and Victoria. Great session. Really, I think from our standpoint, really covers the gambit from, confectionery to pets. I love really a wide spectrum there. And I love the Twix commercial recently where I keep seeing on commercial where the lady takes a bite out and the guy opens one and it's magically he only gets one. The other thing too, Heather, I was wondering, and it's come up a lot, and obviously I think many of us have been on it, is Clubhouse, but I think you've alluded to it. I think, I was talking with a friend of mine who works at Wells Fargo on the social media side, and like bringing brands into it right now, I think is like so nascent. It's like really
Yeah.
kind of, how do you really, the way I kind of have viewed it is it's almost like you know, an audio LinkedIn almost, because in some
Yeah.
cases
Yeah.
it's like it's very business focused, but it really does, you know, you talked about dating also because it really runs the gambit all the way to like a more pure social media standpoint. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about Clubhouse from a brand perspective, and if that's something you guys will ever get into if they have it available.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, Clubhouse is definitely an interesting one because I think when we talk about being authentic as a brand, it's like what business does Snickers have to do, hosting a conversation on Clubhouse? But I do think that we were really successful with it on the pedigree work that we did, where it was linking people to potential dogs to get adopted. So that's the lens that we're really looking at for Clubhouse is how do we become of service to the users and the consumers we want to reach. And I think that's a much, we would never get on a club, without having paid media or format opportunities. We would never just come on and tell people to buy a Snickers bar, though I'm sure a lot of people would enjoy that. But that's the kind not what
Snickers
we're looking
stories.
to do. But I think there's, we've been having a lot of internal conversations of the areas that we could cover. There's so much potential there, and so it's just figuring out what makes the most sense, and most importantly, how do we show up in an authentic way?
In an authentic, I think that's
Yeah.
I think that's the hardest part that brands are trying to figure out, is like in an authentic way, because it's a very nuanced sort of experience. But
Exactly.
and listen, also I was really glad to hear what Mars has been doing from a giving back perspective. I thought that was really wonderful. I wasn't aware of that, so I thought that was great. So anyway, well, listen, thank you so much. We appreciate you guys joining us and taking the time out of your day